Hi, College Success. This is your video for your Chapter 7 lecture. So we're going to go ahead and just pull up the slides and the text from your materials folder. So this chapter, excuse me, is all about like different ways of thinking, and you'll see what I mean here: creative thinking, analytical thinking, critical thinking, as well as problem solving, information. So just a whole bunch of different types of thinking. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through here, and then your assignment video will go over what you're doing with the content for this week. And so here are your beginning of the chapter kind of self check-in questions. Do you know how you go about your problem solving? Do you have creative thinking potential? Do you know how to evaluate information? So all of this is information that's going to be covered inside our chapter. So here are the objectives for the chapter. Again, all the different types and ways of thinking. So what do we mean when we say thinking? All right, so first of all, our chapter likes to say like, hey, we want to keep our minds engaged. And so these are just some examples of literally hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of different ways that we can be thinking and spur our creative thinking and our critical thinking. And you might have your own ways that you can do this. And maybe you do use a lot of puzzles, or you do like Sudoku or things like that to really keep your mind engaged. So one of the things that our chapter does start with is creative thinking. And creative thinking, I think, is necessary just about no matter what field you're going into. And so sometimes people really do say like, oh, they're just not creative. But that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have the potential to be. So creative thinking is really looking at problems or issues or ways to do something that is a little different or outside the box, or just, even if you're just tweaking something just the tiniest bit. So how can being a creative thinker help you better as a student? And so that's something I want you to kind of just reflect on your own. In what ways could being creative help you as a student? And so, as I always like to point out, go into the section of the textbooks and really start to look into the details. It has like little beginning questions here. We're going to look through here some of these, but I always like to have you go into the textbook to look as well. So sometimes when people think creative, they think of like art or like, visual art or maybe expression in some way, but it doesn't have to be that way all the time. You can see that if you've been familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, this is kind of an updated version of it. We have different ways of knowing and understanding things, and one of the newest versions says that creating is the highest level that we can do. Now again, that does not necessarily mean you're creating something like a piece of art or music or anything like that. You could be creating a paper, you could be creating a visual of some sort that's not artistic, but there are different ways to be creative. And so creating something out of old or new is a way to be creative in your thinking. So how can we do this? First of all, you don't want to just peg yourself as not a creative thinker. You want to be able to try to generate new ideas. Now, this is something, and you're going to see this on one of your assignments. Mark Twain is quoted as saying, there is no such thing as a new idea. So I want you to think about that. Do you believe that? Do you think that is true, that there are no ideas, new ideas? We are just like recycling ideas over and over through the years. So just something kind of neat to think about. So also part of creative thinking is trying to come up with ideas that are original to you, and how can you do that? So here are some suggestions. Track your ideas, visualize your goals, use pictures from different sources. So really try to think of ways that have not been done or approached, or someone that does something and you can apply it to your situation. So there are ways to start trying to be creative. You also may have to kind of push yourself into an area that is unfamiliar. So trying something new, taking risks, coming up with unconventional ideas, even if it makes you a little anxious, working with other people. In my SSC 101 class, they have to come up with alternate uses for common everyday objects. And they have to compare, how do they do this on their own? What does their list look like? And then what does their list look like once they talk about it in a group? And almost all the time when they talk about like alternate or creative uses for everyday items in a group, the list is more, I would say, like they consider it creative. There are various uses. They are more unconventional, because sometimes when we talk to other people, we just start getting like ideas and we bounce off one another. So another thing that people, you might hear it this way, like, oh, we've always done it this way. Oh, well, that's sometimes an excuse to, I don't want to say be lazy, but to maybe not take risks. So a lot of times big companies will say this, like, we've always done it this way, so we need to continue doing it this way. That's not necessarily the best way to approach creative thinking. Here are other ways to kind of spur that. This talks about being with other people, monitoring your progress, organizing your thoughts. All of these are ways that are going to help you. So again, if you feel like creative thinking is something that is maybe a struggle for you, really look into this section a little bit more in depth, see what else they have to say, who's considered like a creative thinker. This is like a little activity you could think through. It's not required by any means. So just take a look at this section. Here's a website, couple ideas that you can look at to develop further. All right, the next section talks about then analytical thinking, looking at the pieces and parts, really analyzing how something works, how the parts fit together with the whole. So it says when we work out a problem systematically, it's called analytical thinking. And so we're looking at information literacy, we're looking at different sources, and they kind of use this like package analogy here to visualize this. So this, and it also uses this idea of component parts. If you've ever looked at this in terms of a research paper, this goes into ideas of how to look at something in parts. And this is also where the assembly line came up with, like looking at ways to increase production, analytical thinking. They use Henry Ford in the assembly line. Analytical thinking oftentimes leads to and is connected to critical thinking, really looking at something in a way that is unbiased, looking at the difference between facts and opinions, looking at the situation and the context. And so this gives like a little example, like whenever we do something even as small as preparing our lunch, we are thinking critically. And we are doing this in our day-to-day life. We are constantly looking at information, making decisions, looking at choices, evaluating those choices, finally making the decision and looking at how that decision went, which leads into problem solving. So if we are trying to problem solve, there are steps that we should be looking at, questioning things, looking at our sources, trying to put our own assumptions aside. This was something we talked about in a previous quiz, looking at our preset biases and how those might get in the way of, picking sources or communicating with other people. So whenever we are problem solving or critically thinking, here are things that we want to just kind of keep in mind of, knowing that sometimes things change. We have to be flexible. We have to be able to kind of adapt as needed. Making sure that we are not only checking our own bias, but also being aware that other people have bias. And so knowing when someone is using a fact versus an opinion, this is something that if I had you in person, we would do like a fact and opinion kind of analysis and look and see, because sometimes it's not as clear cut as people believe. There are some authors who are really great at making it look like their opinions are fact. And so you have to be able to really acutely look and see, is this fact verifiable? Can I measure this? Is it observable? Or is this someone's opinion? Is this someone's judgment? Or is this an informed opinion? It's an opinion, but it's based on facts. So really making sure that you are looking at this, and this is what goes into detail here. A fact backed up with evidence, verified, whereas an opinion is your assumption, a belief, a perception, a judgment. Knowing the difference between those things and how they can be presented is all part of that critical thinking. And then again, problem solving. We are constantly problem solving every day, especially in your field or as a parent or as a student. We are constantly trying to problem solve. And so this is the steps that we should take whenever we are trying to problem solve. So for instance, if you were, let's just say you're thinking about going for your spring schedule, what's the issue? Do you want to take a spring schedule? Do you want to take a full load, a light load? Look at other perspectives, considering how is this going to impact my employer or my student or fellow students, my children, my spouse, whoever that might be, all the possible results, really looking at your options, select them, and then communicate and reevaluate how that's, problem solving went. So this is, I wouldn't say like you use this process for everyday decisions, but like larger decisions, you should be trying to be kind of thoughtful and deliberate with those decisions, making sure that you are going through and really evaluating each of those steps. And sometimes when we problem solve, we're going to rely on all these different types of thinking, critical, analytical, creative, to make sure that we are coming to a decision in a way that is going to be, the best for ourselves and anyone involved. Oftentimes we want to maybe even come up with multiple solutions. Even if it's just, you only choose one at the end, multiple solutions or multiple alternatives can allow you to kind of have backup plans. And then the last little bit starts talking about metacognition. Metacognition means thinking about thinking. So how are you aware of your own thinking? I always like to tell the story. I have a student years ago who on vocabulary quizzes was doing very poorly. And I asked him, like, how are you studying? He said, flashcards. I said, okay, well, what kind of learner are you? And he was a visual, more auditory learner with visual as like his second preference. And I said, well, let's try some auditory preferences. So we started studying, I with him and then he at home, saying the words out loud and having them repeated and someone reading them to him. And he slowly started to see his scores go up. He was not being metacognitive at first. He was not thinking about his own thinking processes. So metacognition means, are you aware of how you think, of what works, what doesn't work for you, make adjustments as needed. So metacognition is just really thinking about your own processes and then using that to adjust accordingly. Other things that metacognition does is really making sure you're deliberate with how you plan your activities, your strategies, how you track them, and how then you assess and think back how it went. And then finally, information literacy, really looking at, this goes back to, determining like between fact and opinion. So how can you verify sources? If you are on your own looking up research information, how can you verify sources? How can you look to see, is this a reliable, credible source? What's the purpose of this source? Where did you retrieve the source? In your text, go here. This really goes into more detail about looking and seeing how can you verify. And if you are in a face-to-face class or even an online class, and we'll talk about the digital library in here as well. The digital library is a great place to go to help talk about, really making sure you're using credible sources. And so this goes into more detail about looking at different websites and looking to see, when is it published? Are they trying to just provide us information, or is there bias present? Are we taking anything for face value? Like if we're looking at social media, we have to be really careful the kind of information we take for, truth or opinion on social media. So here is like little activities again. Something also that I think is important that goes along with the information literacy is knowing about these sources, and they use examples of these scholarly sources here. So you want to pay attention on these scholarly sources to, when are they published? What is their purpose? Look at the user domain if you are looking at something online, and you kind of want to stay away from the .coms. You want to really focus on maybe .govs, .orgs, even .edus. Sometimes they're reliable, but they might be more trying to tell you to go into a certain field or looking at their college. But you want to make sure that you're looking at that domain and how that's going to be helpful, or what role that's going to play when you're looking at sources. So this goes into a lot of detail about looking at all this information literacy and making sure that you are evaluating sources and taking the time to look at them and from different perspectives and analyze their usage behind it. And this goes into more verifying source validity, evaluation of all these different sources. Here's that copy of that article. Scholarly articles. If you are using our database to find scholarly articles, a lot of the work is already done for you. They've been kind of vetted, if you will, and then that gives a little bit more trust to it. But if you go on the open web on your own, you really have to pay attention to the kind of information you are getting. This goes into the domain and, looking at who it is that's writing it, when did this come out, because you don't want to be looking at a website that was published in 2015 already. That's pretty out of date depending on what field you are in. Here's that table replicated there, and then making sure that you are managing your resources. Okay, so what I really would encourage you to do is think about the ways that you problem solve, where your strengths are. Are you more of like an analytical thinker? Do you struggle with creative thinking? And just really look at that section and kind of see if there's any ideas on how you can become a stronger creative thinker, a stronger analytical thinker, right? And then make sure you check out the assignment video that is going to go over the information connected to this chapter.